Hey there everybody, this is Rick Usey with today's broadband deployment news. Today I'm going to be talking about middle mile infrastructure in the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act that passed recently. I will be right back. Thanks for joining me. Rick Usey here, VP Marketing at Zecorum. So I've been talking about the Broadband Infrastructure Act, went through some of the provisions of the Act, talked about some things related to that, but a lot of that was about the last mile deployment and some of the funds that are going to be available there. Today I want to talk a little bit about the middle mile deployment, which is another small section of that. So let's talk through that. So this is actually, well, I've got some sections here highlighted though. I wanted to show you though actually let me go over here. I wanted to show you, so this is the actual document. I will link to this, but it's really long, lots of text, lots and lots of text. If you can see up here is where the little cursor, or the page markers, I should say. So I've got it scrolled down to the section on middle mile broadband, which is right, where's my mouse, which is right down here somewhere. So it's quite a ways down. So again, this is the section enabling middle mile broadband infrastructure. And I wanted to go through a couple of definitions just first, so we're clear on that as I'm talking through this. So first is anchor institution, and this is the same for the last mile deployments, I believe, as well as the middle mile. So they have it as a school, library, medical or healthcare provider, community college, or other institution of higher education, or other community support organization or entity. And actually in the section on last mile, or actually when it's defining anchor institutions, it also mentions that these will be institutions that will be helping to promote or educate on broadband services. So, I think it mentions hospitals and some other things. So there is that caveat in there in other areas. Eligible entity, normally we're thinking about a state here. When you're talking about last mile broadband and who's going to get these funds, it would be allocated to a state, one of the 50 states, or some money is allocated, distributed amount between territories, U.S. territories. But here under this section, it's a little bit more expanded. So it looks like these could get direct funds. So it does say a state, but also political subdivision of a state, tribal government, technology company, electric utility, utility cooperative, public utility district, telecommunications company, telecommunications cooperative, nonprofit foundation, nonprofit corporation, nonprofit institution, nonprofit association, regional planning council, native entity or economic development authority. A partnership of two or more of these entities described in this subparagraph. So you could have two or more of these entities come together in a partnership, like a public-private partnership or something like that. So this is well expanded from the last mile kind of service that we see in the larger broadband infrastructure funds that are coming. So there again, it's usually just a state. That money goes to the state, and then the state determines which of these entities might get those funds. So they can then allocate it to your electric utilities, your telephone companies, your cable companies, municipalities, that kind of thing. Middle mile infrastructure, the term here is defined as any broadband infrastructure that does not connect directly to an end user location, including an anchor institution, and includes leased dark fiber, inter-office transport, backhauls, carrier-neutral internet exchange facilities, carrier-neutral submarine cable landing stations, undersea cables, transport connectivity to data centers, special access transport, and other similar services. Wired or private wireless broadband infrastructure, including microwave capacity, radio tower access, and other services or infrastructure for a private wireless broadband network, such as towers, fiber, and microwave links. We're talking about anything here, any middle mile infrastructure that can transport the signals over longer areas that are not connecting up the end user. So, and this is important. This would be important for, this is very important for municipalities, utilities that might already have fiber in the ground. What else? Telephone companies that maybe are regional telephone companies where they've got transport services that they maybe already use, where they're providing transport services for other service providers that can actually take advantage of some of this middle mile funds to maybe beef up what they've got and participate in here in this middle mile section. I'm going to scroll down a bit past some of the stuff that I didn't want to read through. Purposes of this section are to encourage the expansion and extension of middle mile infrastructure, reduce the cost of connecting unserved and underserved areas to the backbone of the internet, commonly referred to as the last mile. And another definition for you, just to make sure that we have that set, is unserved would be any area where a majority of the folks, I think it might be 90%, are not able to get 20 megabits per second by 3, 25 by 3, and then underserved would be 100 by 20. So if most of the area can't get 100 by 20, that's considered underserved. So under this act, they're going to allocate funds to unserved first, and then they're going to then proceed to underserved, to those areas that are not receiving 100 by 20. In awarding middle mile grants, the Assistant Secretary should give priority to projects that leverage existing rights of way, assets, and infrastructure to minimize financial, regulatory, and permitting challenges. So in other words, you want to be able to use infrastructure that's already in place. Could be poles, conduit, that kind of thing if possible. Projects in which the eligible entity designs the route of the middle mile infrastructure to enable the connection of unserved anchor institutions, including tribal anchor institutions, and projects that facilitate the development of carrier-neutral interconnection facilities, and projects that improve the redundancy and resiliency of existing middle mile infrastructure and reduce regulatory and permitting barriers to promote the construction of new middle mile infrastructure. And I'll get to the end in a minute. So, if you've got infrastructure, telephone poles, that kind of stuff, they want to make sure that there are no barriers in there to other people getting access to that you'd be open to sharing that or making that available, if not sharing it, making it available for a reasonable cost and a reasonable time. Regulated utility should use funds received from a middle mile grant as a supplement to the core utility capital investment plan of the regulated utility. So supplement what's already in place to facilitate increased broadband resiliency or redundancy of existing middle mile infrastructure, or provide connectivity to unserved areas and underserved areas within the service territory of the utility and nearby communities. Middle mile grants, the Assistant Secretary shall establish a program under which the Assistant Secretary makes grants on a technology-neutral, competitive basis to eligible entities for the construction, improvement, or acquisition of middle mile infrastructure. And when you see Assistant Secretary in here, you can just read NTIA, because that is the agency that's managing all of this, and the Assistant Secretary is the person in charge of all of that. Applications for grants, evaluation of applications, so they're going to prioritize it for with various things in mind. Priority to an application from an eligible entity that satisfies 2 or more of the following conditions. So they're going to give priority to if somebody satisfies 2 or more of these. The eligible entity adopts fiscally sustainable middle mile strategies. They commit to offering non-discriminatory interconnect or terrestrial and wireless last mile broadband providers and any other party making a bona fide request. So anybody that comes forward to somebody that's going to provide this middle mile infrastructure needs to be able to not be discriminated against in any way. That would be, for example, a city, municipality that wants to do this, and a lot of times, people say munis shouldn't be able to be providing broadband, and in this act, they're definitely making sure that they don't want that to be an issue. Identify specific terrestrial and wireless last mile broadband providers that have expressed written interest in interconnecting with middle mile infrastructure. Demonstrated sustainable business plans or adequate funding sources. So they want to make sure that whoever's doing this is financially stable and they've got a plan and to make good use of the money. Has identified supplemental investments or in-kind support, such as waived franchise or permitting fees, that will accelerate the competition of the planned project. Has demonstrated that the middle mile infrastructure will benefit national security interests of the United States and the Department of Defense. I don't know what that means, so I would think anything that's providing infrastructure would be good, so I don't know how they demonstrate that specifically for the Department of Defense. Grant application competence, so a requirement that an eligible entity provide evidence that carrying out a proposed project that they'd be carrying out, or could, I should say, are capable of, carrying out a proposed project in a competent manner. That would be financial, technical, and operational capability to carry out the project and operate the middle mile network that they either build or expand. As far as eligibility and this prioritization, they shall agree, this eligible entity shall agree to prioritize connecting middle mile infrastructure to last mile networks that provide or plan to provide broadband service to households in unserved areas. So they want to make sure that you're putting in this infrastructure not just to provide transport from one provider to another, but really that this is a middle mile broadband network will be capable of supporting retail broadband service. So I guess just enough speed and bandwidth. Mapping data, they want to make sure that the eligible entities for this are using the most up-to-date mapping data. So they should use the most recent broadband mapping data available from one of the following sources. The FCC fixed broadband map, which is not yet updated. That's something that's taking place right now, and they hope to have all of those updated FCC maps in place before the NTIA starts allocating funds for all of this stuff. So that will hopefully be in place. Or the state in which they're operating, where the middle mile infrastructure would be. Lots of states have their own broadband maps where they've tried to improve the data that was available in the current FCC maps, which are not very accurate as far as where broadband is. Speed and usage surveys of existing broadband service that demonstrate more than 25% of the respondents display a broadband speed service speed that is slower than the speeds required for an area to qualify as unserved. So again, unserved being 25 by 3. Let's see here. What else we got? Connection to anchor institutions. We talked about what those were. So connection to anchor institutions, to the extent feasible, should ensure that the proposed middle mile broadband network will be capable of providing broadband to an anchor institution at a speed of not less than 1 gig per second for downloads and 1 gig per second for uploads. So 1 gig both ways is what they're looking for anchor institutions. Include direct interconnect facilities that will facilitate the provision of broadband service to anchor institutions located within 1,000 feet of the middle mile infrastructure. So as this middle mile infrastructure is being built or expanded or improved, they want to make sure that if this infrastructure is passing a anchor institution located within 1,000 feet, that there's a facility to provide access to that anchor institution. Interconnection and non-discrimination. They shall offer interconnection in perpetuity, where technically feasible, without exceeding current or reasonably anticipated capacity limitations on reasonable rates and terms. The nature of the interconnection should include both the ability to connect to the public internet and physical interconnection of the for the exchange of traffic. And they shall disclose the applicant's proposed interconnection, non-discrimination, and network management practices in the application. So something is going to be in the application which is not yet developed, that will have that will require whoever's getting this money or requesting these grants that they disclose how they're going to keep this non-discriminatory and their network management practices. That's all going to be in the application. Accountability. This is really for the NTIA. They shall establish sufficient transparency, accountability, reporting, and oversight measures for the grant program established under, and then there's a subsection, to deter waste, fraud, and abuse of program funds. So again, as they're developing this, the procedures before they send out this notice of funding available on this, they're going to have these things in place to deter waste, fraud, and abuse of funds. Build-out requirements for each eligible entity that receives a middle mile grant, which shall require that the completion of a certain percentage of the project miles by a certain date, and penalties which may include rescission of funds. So again, they will put together what the dates are. So if you're going to accept these funds, there will be a date. Again, we said there was a 5-year, but I wouldn't be surprised if they have milestones that you have to reach within those 5 years, rather than just saying, okay, you got 5 years to do it and do it. There'll probably be milestones, and then you'll have to meet those, and then there will be penalties if you don't, which may include, I should say, rescission of funds. And then extensions, they may extend the build-out deadline for a number of reasons. This is very similar to what's in the other portions of the text, where they'll grant you extensions for just about anything, I guess, if you can make a good case for it, including extenuating circumstances. Federal share. So there is a share that you would have to pay as a middle mile infrastructure entity. The amount of middle mile grant awarded for an eligible entity may not exceed 70% of the total project cost. So you're looking like at I guess a 30% share. Special rules for tribal governments. There's waivers for that. May waive or specify alternative requirements for any provisions of these certain subsections here that you can read through. Tribally unserved areas. The NTIA, in consultation with tribal governments and native entities, shall develop a process for designating tribally unserved areas and tribally underserved areas. I'm not sure why it's got to be different, because these broadband maps, I would think, should have the tribal areas included as well. A lot of that's going to be feedback from service providers and from consumers in the area, I would think, including these tribal areas. So I'm not sure why they have to come together on what that is there. There's authorization of appropriations, and this is the final bottom line here. There's authorized to be appropriated to carry out this section $1 billion for fiscal years 2022 through 2026. So out of the $65 billion in broadband funds that are part of the IIJA, $1 billion is for middle mile infrastructure. That doesn't seem like very much. $1 billion is a lot, but when you consider $65 billion, that doesn't seem like a lot, but that's certainly money that's available. And there's people that are organizations that are well suited for this. I wanted to bring up one thing from a kind of a lobbying group for what is it? It's had it here. I just dropped some. The National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners is what this is. Resolution supporting energy company communications infrastructure for broadband expansion. So this was something that they adopted in their last meeting back in November, because they realized that utilities are in an excellent place to be able to provide middle mile infrastructure. And they're also in a great place to provide in-kind kinds of contributions, such as, maybe if they've already got fiber conduit somewhere, if they've got pole attachments that they can use as in-kind contributions, but they're in a great position to do that. So basically, just reading from this adoption here, says, whereas the lack of broadband options in some communities reflects the reality of high cost of rural buildout and the customer density dependent business models of traditional consumer broadband offerings, a challenge similar to that faced by efforts to bring electric service to rural communities 75 years ago. So basically they're saying broadband's kind of in the place of where electric was, rural electric, years ago. And whereas constructing wired and/or wireless private broadband networks for grid modernization, utilities will deploy certain infrastructure that provides middle mile connectivity, not extending to the customer premises, such as fiber optic cable, radio towers, power connections. So again, they're already kind of doing this to be able to do their grid modernization. So they've got this middle mile infrastructure, could be through fiber or through radio towers. It's already there, and they're already putting it, and they can certainly expand it. Whereas an energy company constructing such a network could share or augment certain middle mile infrastructure for a lease by a consumer internet service provider, leveraging the energy company infrastructure to reduce the cost of bringing broadband internet access to unserved or underserved communities, which is exactly the purpose, right, of this middle mile infrastructure in this act. Whereas those communities will benefit from both the increased availability of consumer broadband and the increased grid efficiency. So in other words, let's kill two birds with one stone, right? Increase the efficiency of your smart grid, and then also be able to provide middle mile infrastructure. You get some revenue from that, and you're improving broadband in the area for unserved and underserved. So based on that, they said, now therefore be it resolved that the Board of Directors of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners encourages regulators and industry to support and facilitate the deployment of utilities of wired and wireless, secure, reliable broadband networks. In the planning of such networks, energy companies should, to the extent that they are authorized and is feasible, consider sharing or making available wired and wireless middle mile communications infrastructure to support the expansion of consumer broadband access. During the planning of any wireless portion, coordinate to reduce equipment costs and enable provision of network services to other utilities with overlapping service territories. So share these facilities with others. To the extent permissible, state legislators and appropriate agencies and commissions should consider identifying and mitigating any overly burdensome legislative or regulatory obstacles to the expeditious deployment of energy company wired and wireless networks. So asking local legislators and governments to get out of the way, to get some of the red tape out of the way, and to encourage the leveraging of middle mile infrastructure for broadband expansion in unserved and underserved communities. Again, that's the goal of the IIJA, and they're trying to sync up with that. And again, this was adopted by the NARUC on November 9th, 2021. So that's it. That's a little bit about middle mile, if that's something that would apply to you, and I think it would if you are a telecommunications provider, again, that's providing maybe a regional kind of service, or even maybe a local service. You could still do middle mile maybe for other operators that want to come in. Again, maybe that open access shared, or utilities, governments, municipalities. So I think this applies to a lot of folks. So don't forget, don't forget the $1 billion that's available by looking at the $45 billion. Don't forget there's $1 billion there for middle mile access. So thanks for joining me. If this was helpful to you, give me a like on the video, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and click the little bell, and you'll be notified when I'm live. I'm live pretty much every day doing a broadband deployment news like this, as well as Tech Tuesdays every 3 o'clock on other broadband and tech, broadband service provider kinds of topics every Tuesday at 3 o'clock for Tech Tuesday. So join me then as well. Thanks again, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.